Hello and welcome. This is a lesson on the Tower of Babel that I decided to record because it comes up in our series on Daniel, but it's also for anyone who's interested in what to make of this strange story way at the beginning of the Bible, the story of the Tower of Babel, Genesis 11. Okay. So if you are watching this for Daniel, you'll want to watch it before lesson 2 or before lesson 3, right in there. So this text is at the end of the first section of Genesis. So Genesis 1 to 11. Now in Genesis 12, we have the call of Abraham, and that is the start of the theological history of the people of Israel. But before that, in Genesis 1 through 11, we have a kind of a different genre of material. It's filled with origin stories of the world as God made it, for how things came to be. And you'll notice that after chapters 1 and 2, the dual story of creation, things began to go downhill. We get Adam and Eve in the garden, where they want to gain wisdom on their own apart from God. And because of their rebellion, they're sent away from the garden. It's a fracturing of relationship with God and with one another. And then we have Cain and Abel, brothers, but because of the rivalry between them, their relationship is fractured to the point of murder. And the murderer is cast out into the earth. He builds a city, and the city begins to develop technology and art. But Cain's descendant Lamech takes 2 wives instead of 1, and he murders a young man for insulting his honor. And he brags about that in a song, and he claims for himself the protection that God had offered Cain. Well, humanity is filling the earth, but we continue to get this increased violence and the fracturing of relationship. Humanity is becoming more and more broken until the point where, though God had said that people were to cover the earth, now violence has covered the earth. We see God's grief at the wickedness of humans and his sending of the floodwaters to wash away the violence of fractured humanity. After the flood, there's a new chance with Noah and his 3 sons, and they multiply over generations so that they become the nations of the world. Genesis 10 describes this in the Table of Nations. It's a map, it's stylized, it has 70 nations at the end, and it says, oh, there are some more. But they gave 70 because 70 is this number of completion, right? It's how the descendants of Japheth, Ham, and Shem spread out into the world. And it has names of people, their descendants, but each name is like a geographical area that came to be known by the people group who lived there. So if we look in the descendants of Japheth, one of the places we have is Javan or Yavan, which is the Hebrew word for Greece. We have Ashkenaz, the Hebrew word for what we would call Eastern Europe. We have Kittim, Italy. So, the descendants of Japheth are sort of filling the wider Mediterranean world. When we see Ham, we see Cush, which is Ethiopia, Mizraim, which is Egypt. Your translation may even say Egypt and then have a footnote or vice versa. We have Canaan, the land of Canaan, where the Israelites eventually settled. And all of those people are listed in the genealogy of Ham. And we're seeing as we go that humanity's multiplying, they're separating, they're filling the land, and you eventually have these many nations, each with its own language. It says that in verse 5, verse 20, and verse 31. Basically, after each of those brothers, you say each had his own language. And part of the point is that all these nations, they're actually related, right? They are siblings and cousins who, and what's implied is that the reader can look around and say, all these nations are now at odds, in rivalry, in wars with one another, but they are actually part of God's one humanity, right? Now, right as the Table of Nations gets started, the genealogy pauses to tell you kind of a mini story. In verse 8, it says Cush, Ethiopia, was the father of a guy named Nimrod. And Nimrod was a mighty warrior upon the earth, a mighty hunter before the Lord. And he's renowned. It says that's why it's said. Everyone talks about him because he's a mighty hunter before the Lord. Mighty guy. And he founded some cities like, verse 10, the city of Babylon. Now, your translation may say Babel. Babel and Babylon are two translations of the same word in Hebrew. There's no difference between them. Babel is Babylon. So it pauses to tell us something about the founding of the city of Babylon. And then it finishes the Table of Nations. And then in chapter 11, we get this story. It's like, okay, I told you about all the nations, each with his own language. But back before there were all the languages, let me tell you about it. So chapter 11 is a little flashback back to the time highlighted with mighty guy Nimrod, but it's placed at the end of this first section of Genesis because it is the culmination of the sad story of fracturing humanity that we get in Genesis 3 through 11. So the story is, back before there were nations and languages, some people moved eastward. And we remember eastward is away from the presence of God in biblical kind of language. When Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden, they're sent east. When Cain is sent away for murdering his brother, he goes east. So they move eastward, and the ones that found the plain of Shinar, they settled there. Those people said to one another, let's build ourselves a city. Let's build ourselves a tower. And a tower, we could picture like a ziggurat in the architecture of the day. A tower is normally what? Why do you make a tower? It's usually a palace or a temple, right? For aggrandizement of the king or worship of the god. So they're going to make a tower. They say, verse 4, we don't want to be scattered abroad over the face of the earth. We see humanity fracturing. We see the rivalry and the separation. Let's fix it. Let's fix it ourselves by being at the top. Let's build a tower whose top, literally whose head, the word is head, will reach into heaven. And the Hebrew word for heaven is the same word for sky. So that's the place where the gods dwell, right? Let's put our heads into heaven so that we can make a name for ourselves, it says. Now, we have to read this story in parallel to the story in Genesis 3, the rebellion in the garden. When humans said, Adam and Eve said that the fruit of the tree was desirable to make one wise, knowing good and evil, without having to depend on God. The rebellion in the garden was about let's know good and evil for ourselves. And now we see on the plain of Shinar, it's let's make a name for ourselves. They're going to use technology, they say. They're not just stacking stones anymore. Now they have the ability to make bricks, right? This technology will allow them to do more than they could have ever done before. To make a name for ourselves, to exalt our group of people, our city or our nation over the others. We'll unite our part of humanity on our own terms to put our head in the heavens on the level with the gods ourselves without having to depend on God. And that's why God reacts as he does. So in the garden, God says, behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, meaning with wisdom that's not dependent on God and therefore not reliable. Behold, the man has become, and now he might stretch out his hand and take also from the tree of life and live forever. This is man's own definition of right and wrong, plus the power of the source of life. This will be a disaster. Right? You don't put the toddler in the driver's seat of the car and send them off, right? God says the damage that mankind can do, mankind who's made in the image of God, that is a a vast ability that God has given mankind. And now they're out of the guidance of God for wisdom. The damage they can do is too much. And so the severe mercy of God is to drive them out of the garden. Well, on the plane of Shinar, we get the same kind of response, right? To the people group trying to exalt themselves, make a name for themselves over other people, right? The sentence is constructed in parallel. Behold, they are one people. They all have the same language, and this is what they begin to do. And now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. It's behold, they've seized this, grasped at this thing for themselves, and now they can do so much damage. So he says, mankind be banding together to exalt one nation with technology to serve them over the other nations will be a disaster. They can do so much damage. They're unified. Their little part is unified, right? That's the stuff of ancient atrocities and modern world wars, right? To exalt one people group over the others with technology to serve them, to make a name for themselves without reference to the wisdom of God. And God says, it's too dangerous. They can do too much damage. And so again, the severe mercy is to drive them away, apart. The languages separate. They're scattered over the face of the earth, the very thing they were trying not to do. And then it says, so the place was called Babylon. The word Babylon, or Babel, sounds like the Hebrew word for confusion. Balal. So it was founded, the city, by the mighty guy. They did a mighty thing, but it was outside of reference to God and reverence to God. And it was bad because it was all about themselves, and it was dangerous. And so God sends them apart, okay? This is Scripture's culminating story for the downward spiral that humans create when they try to be in charge apart from God. Individually wise without dependence on God. Then they try to fix the situation by dividing nations, by being exalted themselves over the nations without reverence for God. And we know the kind of damage that can do on the level of personal relationships, all the way to violence at a geopolitical level. And God will, this ends that section of chapter 1 through 11. We've seen that basically people make a hash of it. They make a mess. They make a disaster of it, a dangerous disaster. And God will, beginning chapter 12, have his own rescue plan for humanity. He'll call a no-name guy, not the mighty guy who's renowned, who everyone says, "Ooh, mighty hunter before the Lord," but a no-name guy out of a different people group, Abram. And instead of a powerhouse city with technology at their service, he'll be a no-man in a land not his own, waiting for God to gift him with a nation, a people, and a name. And in the end, his descendant, all the way to Jesus, right? His descendant will be not only human, but also God in the flesh. That Messiah will actually rescue violent, fractured humanity. So this is the story of Scripture, the story of all of humanity. And we see that it's universal when we see what happens when people seek exaltation outside of dependence of God, how God is going to rescue the whole world. But it's also the story of the founding of Babylon, right? Babylon, a city, a nation, which is going to be a power that's going to roll over the Israelites, destroying many people groups in the ancient world. They are the people that think our heads in the heavens. We are exalted. We can act like gods, right? And they take Israel into exile. They exalt themselves. And so when we read the Daniel story, and as we meet Nebuchadnezzar, we know this is the backstory for the founding of Babylon and powers like it that the scripture provides. And so we keep that in mind when we see how Babylon behaves in the book of Daniel. Thanks for listening. And if you have questions or you want to start a conversation, I hope you will message me either by commenting on this, messaging me through my website, deannamunger.com. Any way that you want to is great. Contact me on Instagram, direct message or comment, and we can talk more about what this means for us. And you can always join our study of Daniel as we continue through the scripture. Thanks.